the imperial origins of oil financing, and the pre-petrodollar era. To comprehend the complex architecture of the modern global economy and the overarching dominance of the United States dollar, it is absolutely essential to begin by tracing the historical timeline back to the late 19th century. Long before the term petrodollar was coined, the foundational relationship between elite supranational banking syndicates and the extraction of global energy resources was firmly established. During the 1870s, Imperial Russia made the strategic decision to abolish its state monopoly on oil, thereby opening the vastly resource-rich Caucasus region to private enterprise. Initial development was dominated by the Nobel brothers, who successfully established competing refineries, but found themselves entirely unable to enter the global marketplace due to a severe lack of transportation infrastructure. To solve this logistical bottleneck, the Caspian and Black Sea Petroleum Company, widely known by its Russian acronym BNITO, sought external capital. This capital was readily provided by the French branch of the incredibly wealthy Rothschild family. The Rothschilds financed the construction of a massive railway system connecting the Caspian and Black Seas, an engineering feat that allowed Russian oil to be exported globally for the first time. Recognizing the strategic value of this commodity, the Rothschild family subsequently established extensive storage facilities and purchased BNITO entirely in the year 1886. The entry of the Rothschild dynasty into the petroleum industry fundamentally transformed its nature, shifting the focus of Russian oil from domestic consumption to aggressive global market penetration. This decisive move subsequently spurred American entities, most notably the Standard Oil Company, founded by John D. Rockefeller in 1870, to reinvent themselves as sprawling multinational corporations. Concurrently, banking magnates such as J.P. Morgan were rapidly organizing coalitions of financiers that would ultimately modernize and control the American monetary system. This early period established a permanent precedent wherein elite Western financial families controlled the massive capital flows required for global energy extraction. As the 20th century progressed, the strategic importance of oil became undeniable, particularly as a deciding factor in the outcomes of global military conflicts. Following the devastation of the Second World War, the victorious Allied nations convened in 1944 to establish a new international financial order. The resulting Bretton Woods system officially established the United States dollar as the world's anchor currency. Under this system, the dollar was firmly pegged to gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce, and all other major global currencies were subsequently pegged to the dollar. This arrangement cemented American economic dominance, operating on the foundational assumption that the United States government held sufficient physical gold reserves to back the international circulation of its paper currency. Simultaneously, the geopolitical chessboard of the Middle East was being organized to secure the energy required to rebuild the post-war world. In February 1945, United States President Franklin D. Roosevelt held a highly secretive and historic meeting with King Abdul Aziz bin Saud of Saudi Arabia aboard the United States Navy heavy cruiser USS Quincy in the Great Bitter Lake of Egypt. Emerging from the war, the United States recognized a desperate need for secure energy supplies and faced rapidly increasing international competition for access to Saudi Arabian oil fields. During this meeting, a foundational pact was sealed. Saudi Arabia promised a reliable, uninterrupted supply of oil to the United States. In direct exchange, the United States promised to provide comprehensive military security against both great global powers and regional adversaries, establishing a bilateral relationship that would endure for decades and set the stage for the monetary revolution that was to come. The Nixon Shock and the collapse of the Bretton Woods system. The global financial stability established by the Bretton Woods Agreement persisted through the post-war economic boom. But by the late 1960s, the architecture began to show severe structural fractures. The United States found itself beset by aggressively high inflation and increasingly large current account deficits, driven by the massive domestic spending of the Great Society programs and the staggering financial costs of an ongoing, protracted war in Vietnam. This excessive printing of dollars to fund what economists refer to as a guns and butter policy put immense downward pressure on the value of the American currency. Foreign central banks, astutely recognizing that the United States was printing far more paper dollars than it held in physical gold reserves, became increasingly reluctant to hold the depreciating currency. Consequently, these foreign nations began aggressively exercising their rights under the Bretton Woods Agreement to convert their dollar reserves back into physical gold, severely threatening to drain the United States gold reserves entirely. Faced with the imminent collapse of the national treasury, United States President Richard Nixon executed a drastic and unilateral macroeconomic maneuver in August 1971. Nixon officially suspended the direct convertibility of the United States dollar into gold. This event, historically referred to as the Nixon Shock, effectively terminated the Bretton Woods international monetary system of fixed exchange rates, abruptly transitioning the global economy into a highly volatile era of fiat currencies that began to float against one another by 1973. Without the backing of physical gold, the United States dollar was incredibly vulnerable, and its purchasing power began to decline rapidly. In an attempt to compensate for this devaluation, the Persian Gulf members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries convened in January 1972 and signed the Geneva Agreement with foreign oil companies. This agreement mandated a substantial increase in the posted prices of petroleum, specifically designed to restore the purchasing power that the oil-producing nations had lost due to the depreciation of the newly unpegged American dollar. However, this compensatory measure was merely a prelude to a much larger geopolitical earthquake. In October 1973, the Yom Kippur War erupted in the Middle East. As the United States and Western Europe provided vital military support and resupply to the State of Israel during the conflict, the Arab members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries retaliated by launching a devastating oil embargo against the supportive Western nations. The embargo acted as a massive supply shock, fundamentally destabilizing the global energy market. The price of crude oil skyrocketed, quadrupling in a matter of months. This sudden and violently engineered price increase plunged the industrialized world into a severe economic recession characterized by crippling stagflation. Conversely, it initiated an unprecedented transfer of global wealth into the sovereign treasuries of the Middle Eastern oil-exporting nations, fundamentally altering the balance of global financial power and setting the absolute necessity for a new monetary architecture. The genesis of the petrodollar and the 1974 Saudi Agreement. The devastating economic impact of the oil shock left the Nixon administration desperate to find a new mechanism to reinforce global demand for the fiat dollar and to manage the incredible wealth suddenly accumulating in the Middle East. The sheer size of the increase in the oil exporters' wealth made it mathematically impossible for those nations to spend the capital on domestic goods and services. Saudi Arabia's current account surplus in 1974 alone was an astonishing 51% of its total gross domestic product. Operating against a domestic backdrop of great economic and political uncertainty, as the Watergate scandal pushed the Nixon presidency toward its eventual collapse, the administration embarked on a highly secretive and critical diplomatic mission. The objective was to cement an economic partnership with Saudi Arabia that would permanently anchor the global energy trade to the American financial system. In 1974, United States Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and the fiercely pro-market United States Treasury Secretary William Simon engaged in extensive negotiations with the Saudi royal family, specifically King Faisal and Prince Fahd. The resulting strategic agreement was elegantly simple but macroeconomic in its consequences. Saudi Arabia agreed to price its oil exports exclusively in United States dollars, completely refusing all other foreign currencies as payment for their petroleum. Furthermore, the Saudi government agreed to take their massive surplus oil revenues, the billions of dollars flooding into their central bank, and reinvest them directly into United States Treasury bonds and American financial securities. In direct exchange for this massive financial concession, the United States provided an ironclad guarantee of military protection for the Saudi monarchy and its oil fields, while also ensuring the kingdom's access to highly advanced American military equipment and weapons systems. This arrangement birthed what became known globally as the petrodollar system. Because oil is the world's most heavily traded and fundamentally necessary commodity, every single nation required a constant supply of dollars to purchase the energy required to run their domestic economies. The petrodollar agreement brilliantly and synthetically manufactured a permanent, structural global demand for the United States currency, effectively replacing the gold standard with an oil standard. Following Saudi Arabia's lead, other members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries quickly fell into line, standardizing the dollar-based oil trade across the globe. This entrenched the United States dollar's global monetary hegemony, granting the United States government the exorbitant privilege of exerting massive geopolitical influence without facing the typical fiscal constraints that bound every other nation on Earth. The mechanics of petrodollar recycling and the eurodollar market. With the geopolitical agreement in place, the practical mechanics of managing this unprecedented flow of capital had to be constructed. The process by which the surplus dollars earned from oil exports were reinvested back into the Western financial system became universally known as petrodollar recycling. The structural flow was a massive, continuous loop. Oil-importing nations sent dollars to the Middle East to secure energy, and the oil-producing nations immediately deposited those exact dollars into Western banks, which then loaned the capital back out. Debate over how to manage this recycling process was fiercely contested. Proponents of state-managed economies, such as British Chancellor of the Exchequer Denis Healey, proposed a comprehensive, officially managed recycling scheme rooted entirely through the International Monetary Fund, ensuring that the capital was distributed equitably to nations struggling with massive energy deficits. However, this socialist approach clashed violently with the free market ideologies of the American administration. United States Treasury Secretary William Simon, a former bond trader known for his ruthless dedication to capitalist markets, bitterly opposed any official interference. Simon and the American government successfully ensured that the petrodollar recycling process was governed almost entirely by private United States commercial banks, allowing these institutions to reap enormous profits from the global crisis. The primary destination for this recycled wealth was the eurodollar market. The eurodollar market consisted of a vast pool of dollar-denominated liquidity held in commercial banks located completely outside the regulatory jurisdiction of the United States, predominantly in financial centers like London. This market had originally been developed during the Cold War by state-owned Soviet banks in Eastern Europe that wished to keep their dollar holdings out of the reach of American regulators in New York. By utilizing the eurodollar market, Western commercial banks were able to completely evade domestic financial repression, specifically bypassing the Federal Reserve's regulation queue, which placed strict ceilings on the interest rates that domestic banks could offer to depositors. This lack of regulation allowed banks in London and Paris to offer significantly higher interest rates, easily capturing the massive deposits from the Saudi Arabian Monetary Agency and other Gulf central banks. Awash in an ocean of petrodollar liquidity, the top 21 largest United States banks saw their assets skyrocket to nearly $400 billion by the end of 1975, completely dwarfing the capital reserves of official institutions like the International Monetary Fund. Driven by a fierce herd mentality and the pursuit of extreme profit, these commercial banks abandoned traditional lending standards. Instead of linking loans to specific, productive infrastructure projects, they began blindly extending massive loans to developing countries in Latin America and Africa, simply to cover those nations' rising balance of payment deficits caused by the expensive oil. This aggressive petrodollar recycling directly precipitated the catastrophic Third World debt crisis that would ravage the global South in the subsequent decade. The shadow government and the influence of elite banking dynasties. The construction of the petrodollar recycling mechanism and the resulting explosion of commercial banking power cannot be analyzed without recognizing the deep, systemic involvement of the world's most powerful financial dynasties, the Rockefellers, the Morgans, and the Rothschilds. Historical and economic analysts frequently point to this era as the solidification of a financial power elite, often critically referred to as a shadow government, which exerted profound influence over the foreign policy apparatus of the United States to ensure that global mechanisms continually served their private banking interests. At the absolute epicenter of this recycling boom was the Chase Manhattan Bank, operating under the chairmanship of David Rockefeller. Chase Manhattan was deeply embedded in the petrodollar flow, acting as a primary correspondent bank for massive international deposits and aggressively expanding its lending operations across the globe. The Rockefeller family's historical roots in the Standard Oil monopoly provided them with an unparalleled understanding of the energy sector, allowing their financial institutions to dominate the capitalization of the oil boom. Concurrently, the House of Morgan, through institutions like J.P. Morgan and Company, played a massive role in intermediating the financial transfers of the 1970s. These elite institutions were not merely passive recipients of capital. Their executives actively shaped American foreign policy. David Rockefeller's founding of the Trilateral Commission in 1973 serves as a primary example. The Trilateral Commission was established as a private, non-governmental organization designed to foster extremely close political and economic cooperation between the elites of North America, Western Europe, and Japan. Critics of the Commission argue that it functioned as a nursery for executive branch officials. For example, Jimmy Carter, a relatively obscure governor, attended the first meetings of the Trilateral Commission before being elevated to the presidency of the United States, subsequently bringing numerous commission members into his cabinet. Economists of the Austrian school, such as Murray Rothbard, analyzed this period through the lens of methodological individualism, arguing that the true history of the 20th century was driven by a great power struggle between the House of Morgan and the Rockefeller interests. According to this analysis, the financial elite recognized that the petrodollar system offered a mechanism to globally expand their fractional reserve banking operations without the constraint of the gold standard. By ensuring that all global energy transactions were funneled through dollar-denominated accounts held in their institutions, these families secured a perpetual, guaranteed flow of enormous capital, effectively dictating the terms of global development and debt. The Rothschild family, leveraging their deep historical ties to early Russian oil exploration and massive European banking networks, continued to operate at the highest levels of international finance, providing discreet advisory and asset management services that facilitated these massive sovereign wealth transfers. Protecting the architecture, military force, and the strategic role of Israel. With the petrodollar system constructed and the global banking apparatus reaping the rewards of recycling, the United States recognized that this monetary hegemony required absolute physical protection. Because the entire value of the United States dollar was now implicitly backed by the free flow of Middle Eastern oil, any disruption to that flow constituted an existential threat to American national security. This reality was formally codified during the 1980s with the implementation of the Carter Doctrine. The doctrine explicitly stated that the United States would use direct military force to protect its vital national interests in the Persian Gulf. Throughout the ensuing decades, the United States military maintained a massive, permanent presence in the region, guaranteeing the open navigation of strategic choke points like the Straits of Hormuz. The ultimate manifestation of this protection was the 1991 Gulf War, wherein hundreds of thousands of American troops were deployed directly to the desert to defend Saudi Arabian oil fields from regional aggression. To further bind the petrodollar loop, the United States continuously approved staggering arms sales to the Gulf monarchies, effectively ensuring that billions of recycled petrodollars were funneled directly into the accounts of American defense contractors, creating a highly lucrative military-industrial symbiosis. Within this vast military architecture, the State of Israel emerged as the most critical and permanent strategic anchor for Western interests in the Middle East. The integration of Israel into the petrodollar security apparatus represents a masterclass in geopolitical maneuvering. While the Arab monarchies provided the oil and the capital, they remained vulnerable to internal revolutions and pan-Arabist socialist movements that frequently threatened to nationalize oil resources and expel Western influence. Israel, possessing a distinct social structure and an absolute reliance on external support for its survival, functioned as a highly dependable, heavily militarized outpost, frequently described by strategists as the largest American aircraft carrier in the world. To maintain this absolute regional deterrence, the United States has provided Israel with over $250 billion in cumulative military aid since 1959. This unprecedented financial support, which guarantees Israel's qualitative military edge over any combination of regional adversaries, is largely enabled by the fiscal freedom that the petrodollar system grants the United States government. The historical ties of the elite banking families are also deeply woven into this anchor. The Rothschild family played a foundational role in the early Zionist movement, financing the initial settlements in the late 19th century and facilitating the 1917 Balfour Declaration, which served as the diplomatic foundation stone for the creation of the Israeli state. In recent years, the strategic integration of Israel has become increasingly formalized. The signing of the Abraham Accords in 2020 marked a historic breakthrough, normalizing diplomatic relations between Israel and Gulf states like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain. Subsequently, Israel was officially integrated into the United States Central Command, allowing for shared intelligence, integrated air defense systems, and coordinated operational planning with moderate Arab militaries. This emerging de facto regional alliance embeds Israel deeply within a defense architecture designed to protect the very Gulf monarchies that sustain the petrodollar, ensuring that any threat to the dollar-based energy infrastructure is met with overwhelming, technologically superior military force. The petrodollar wars and the devastating price of defiance. The absolute necessity of maintaining the petrodollar monopoly means that the United States cannot tolerate any sovereign nation attempting to opt out of the system. The historical record demonstrates a chilling and consistent pattern. Whenever a resource-rich nation attempts to price its oil in a currency other than the United States dollar, it is met with devastating economic warfare, engineered destabilization, or direct military invasion. This grim reality is the foundation of what geopolitical analysts refer to as the petrodollar war theory. The application of this enforcement mechanism began in earnest at the turn of the millennium. In the year 2000, Iraq, holding approximately 112 billion barrels of proven oil reserves, made the fateful decision to defy the American financial order. Under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, Iraq successfully petitioned the United Nations to allow the sale of its oil exports exclusively in euros rather than dollars. As the euro strengthened against the dollar over the next several years, Iraq actually benefited economically from the transition. However, the strategic threat to Washington was unacceptable. If other members of the Organization of the Petroleum Exporting Countries replicated this model, the artificial demand for the dollar would collapse. In 2003, utilizing the justification of weapons of mass destruction, the United States invaded Iraq, destroyed the existing government, and immediately reverted all Iraqi oil sales back to the United States dollar. Less than a decade later, a virtually identical scenario unfolded in North Africa. In Libya, Muammar Gaddafi controlled massive oil reserves alongside a sovereign treasury holding approximately 150 tons of physical gold. Gaddafi aggressively lobbied other African nations to create a Pan-African gold-backed currency known as the dinar, and proposed that all future African oil trades be conducted entirely outside of the dollar system. This proposal directly challenged the global dollar settlement structure. In 2011, a military intervention led by the North Atlantic Treaty Organization effectively demolished the Libyan state, resulting in the brutal execution of Gaddafi and the complete eradication of the gold dinar initiative. The Islamic Republic of Iran also attempted to circumvent the system, pursuing alternative energy exchanges and offering oil priced in euros and the Chinese yuan. In response, the United States leveraged its control over global financial infrastructure to execute crippling economic warfare. Iran was entirely severed from the SWIFT international banking network, freezing its assets and effectively isolating the nation from the global economy. The most recent and protracted enforcement of the petrodollar monopoly occurred in the Western Hemisphere. Venezuela, home to the largest proven oil reserves on the planet, sought to decouple its economy from American financial control under the leadership of Nicolas Maduro. Facing severe sanctions that froze its access to traditional dollar settlements, the Venezuelan government attempted numerous adaptations. They launched a purportedly oil-backed cryptocurrency called the Petro, attempting to completely bypass the traditional banking system. When the Petro failed to gain international traction, Venezuela pivoted to processing billions of dollars in oil sales utilizing the Tether stablecoin, known as USDT, while also engaging in massive barter deals and yuan-denominated settlements with the Chinese government. Recognizing that a non-dollar ecosystem was successfully taking root, the United States escalated its response to a maximum pressure campaign. This involved severe naval blockades designed to choke off Venezuelan exports and the aggressive freezing of national assets abroad. This relentless financial and kinetic siege culminated in a drastic action when the Trump administration orchestrated the capture of Nicolas Maduro in January 2026. The historical narrative remains brutally consistent across decades and administrations. Any attempt to separate sovereign energy production from American monetary policy results in severe, systemic punishment. The connection to the United States economy and the stock exchange. The violent enforcement of the petrodollar system is deemed a national security imperative because the American domestic economy and its financial markets are completely reliant on the artificial subsidies the system provides. The constant, forced recycling of petrodollars serves as the foundational bedrock of modern United States economic stability. Because oil-producing nations historically reinvested their massive dollar surpluses into United States Treasury bonds, the American government enjoyed a permanent, highly liquid market for its national debt. This massive pool of captive foreign capital allowed the United States Treasury to continuously borrow trillions of dollars to fund sprawling government programs, military expansions, and tax cuts while keeping domestic interest rates artificially low. Furthermore, the perpetual global demand for dollars to buy oil kept the exchange rate of the American currency incredibly strong. This artificially strong dollar granted the United States an exorbitant privilege: the ability to import massive quantities of cheap foreign manufactured goods, effectively allowing American citizens to consume far beyond their actual domestic production capacity without triggering hyperinflation. This massive influx of recycled capital was not restricted solely to government bonds. It flooded directly into the United States Stock Exchange, fundamentally altering the valuation and liquidity of American corporations. Sovereign wealth funds, bloated with oil revenues, constantly sought high-yield investments, and the booming American equity markets presented the most attractive destination. The Saudi Arabian Public Investment Fund provides the clearest example of this dynamic. Over the years, the Public Investment Fund injected tens of billions of dollars directly into the United States stock market, acting as a massive pillar of support for American tech and consumer companies. By the fourth quarter of 2021, the Saudi fund's holdings in the United States equity market had reached an absolutely staggering record high of $56.7 billion, spread across dozens of high-profile corporations. This included massive, multi-billion-dollar stakes in companies such as Uber Technologies, Electronic Arts, and the electric vehicle manufacturer Lucid Group. The continuous flow of petrodollars into these equities provided deep market liquidity, allowing American companies to achieve massive market capitalizations and easily fund their expansions. In essence, the retirement accounts and investment portfolios of the American public were continually buoyed by the forced recycling of Middle Eastern oil profits back into Wall Street. The weaponization of SWIFT and the rise of BRICS alternatives. The absolute dominance of the petrodollar relied not just on the currency itself, but on the control of the plumbing that moved the money. For decades, the Society for Worldwide Interbank Financial Telecommunication, universally known as SWIFT, served as the undisputed, internationally recognized standard for global bank messaging and cross-border transactions. Headquartered in Belgium, but heavily influenced by Western governments, SWIFT processes millions of messages daily, moving trillions of dollars across the globe. However, the assumption that SWIFT was a neutral, apolitical utility was shattered in early 2022. Following the Russian invasion of Ukraine, the United States and its European allies weaponized the global financial system, freezing hundreds of billions of dollars in Russian central bank reserves and aggressively expelling major Russian financial institutions from the SWIFT network. While intended to cripple the Russian economy, this unprecedented action sent a terrifying shockwave through the global south. Nations around the world realized that holding their national savings in United States dollars or relying on Western-controlled payment rails represented a massive, existential strategic vulnerability. This realization violently accelerated the efforts of the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, to aggressively transition away from the dollar and construct their own sanction-proof financial architecture. The bloc, which recently expanded to include massive energy powers like Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Egypt, and Iran, now represents nearly half of the world's population and commands a dominant share of global energy production. To bypass SWIFT, these nations began heavily promoting domestic alternatives. China exponentially expanded the reach of its cross-border interbank payment system, or CIPS. Operating entirely independently of American oversight, CIPS processes transactions in the Chinese yuan and has seen massive adoption. By early 2025, CIPS was linking thousands of financial institutions across nearly every continent, processing a staggering 175 trillion yuan annually, proving that a non-dollar clearing mechanism could successfully operate at a global scale. Simultaneously, Russia continued to refine its own internal messaging network, the System for Transfer of Financial Messages, known as SPFS, ensuring its domestic economy remained functional despite Western embargoes. However, the most technologically revolutionary challenge to the petrodollar system emerged in the form of Project Enbridge. Moving beyond simple messaging networks, Enbridge is a highly advanced, blockchain-based platform designed specifically to facilitate instantaneous cross-border settlements using central bank digital currencies. Developed in collaboration with the Bank for International Settlements, the project actively connected the central banks of China, the United Arab Emirates, Thailand, and Saudi Arabia. The implications of Enbridge are profoundly disruptive. By utilizing digital tokenization, participating nations can execute massive, real-value sovereign transfers directly between their central banks in their own local currencies, entirely eliminating the need for Western commercial banks or the United States dollar to act as an intermediary. By late 2025, the platform had transitioned from a theoretical pilot into operational infrastructure, successfully processing thousands of real-world transactions worth over $55 billion, the vast majority of which were settled in the digital yuan. The momentum continued to build. In late October 2024, at the 16th BRICS Summit held in the Russian city of Kazan, the member states officially announced the BRICS Cross-Border Payments Initiative, widely referred to as BRICS Pay. This initiative aims to create a fully decentralized, independent payment messaging mechanism that permanently links the digital currencies of the member nations, effectively creating a parallel financial universe where Western sanctions are mathematically impossible to enforce. The era of American financial unipolarity had definitively ended. Europe's awakening and the push for strategic autonomy. The weaponization of the financial system and the rapid rise of the BRICS alternative networks forced a severe reckoning within the European continent. For decades, Europe had complacently relied on American technology and infrastructure to process its daily commerce. The overwhelming majority of card payments within the Eurozone are routed through American corporate giants like Visa and MasterCard, and international transfers rely entirely on the dollar-centric SWIFT network. Recognizing that this deep dependence on foreign infrastructure fundamentally compromised their economic security and geopolitical independence, European policymakers became obsessed with achieving strategic autonomy. The failure of earlier, clumsy attempts to bypass American sanctions, such as the INSDEX mechanism designed to facilitate trade with Iran, proved that Europe needed far more robust internal systems. In response, major European commercial banks formed the European Payments Initiative. This consortium launched a unified digital wallet known as Wero, designed to seamlessly connect the disparate domestic payment systems of nations like France, Germany, and Belgium into a single continent-wide network capable of handling instant, account-to-account retail transactions without relying on American credit card networks. Concurrently, new European regulatory frameworks, such as the Instant Payments Regulation, mandated that all traditional banks process euro-denominated transfers within 10 seconds, forcing a massive modernization of the continent's internal plumbing. More significantly, the European Central Bank accelerated its timeline for the creation of a sovereign digital euro. Following the successful completion of a multi-year preparation phase in late 2023, the Governing Council officially moved the project into its final development stages. With pilot testing scheduled for 2027 and a potential full public issuance targeted for 2029, the digital euro is not merely a technological upgrade. It is explicitly framed by central bankers as a defensive geopolitical instrument. By issuing retail central bank money directly to citizens, Europe aims to safeguard its monetary sovereignty, prevent American dollar-backed stablecoins from dominating the digital asset space, and ensure that the continent possesses a resilient, internally controlled payment rail that cannot be switched off by actors in Washington or Beijing. The expiration of the Saudi Pact and the Great Decoupling. The culmination of these shifting geopolitical alliances, alternative financial networks, and the general erosion of trust in the United States culminated in a massively symbolic event in the summer of 2024. On the 9th of June, 2024, the original informal 50-year agreement forged between Henry Kissinger, William Simon, and the Saudi royal family quietly expired. Saudi Arabia made the calculated decision not to formally renew the pact. While economists correctly point out that the original agreement was a loose convention rather than a legally binding treaty, the decision to let the milestone pass without reaffirmation sent a deafening signal to the global markets. The Saudi government explicitly demonstrated its willingness to embrace the new multipolar reality, indicating that it was fully prepared to price its petroleum exports in multiple currencies, including the euro and the Chinese yuan, effectively shattering the psychological foundation of the petrodollar monopoly. The macroeconomic consequences of this diplomatic shift materialized rapidly within the United States Stock Exchange. As Saudi Arabia diversified its strategic partnerships and focused heavily on funding its massive domestic economic transition, known as Vision 2030, the continuous flow of recycled petrodollars into American equities began to dry up. The Saudi Public Investment Fund, which had long served as a seemingly bottomless reservoir of capital for Wall Street, initiated a brutal withdrawal. From its peak of over $56 billion in 2021, the fund slashed its holdings relentlessly. By the fourth quarter of 2025, SEC filings revealed that the Public Investment Fund had reduced its total United States equity portfolio to a mere $12.9 billion. This massive capital flight involved the total liquidation of massive stakes in companies like Take-Two Interactive and catastrophic value losses in tech investments like Lucid Group, leaving the fund concentrated in only 5 remaining American companies. The invisible subsidy that had propped up American asset valuations for decades was actively being dismantled. Compounding this financial withdrawal is an even more profound structural threat to the petrodollar, the global transition to green energy. For 50 years, the dollar's supremacy was guaranteed because oil was the absolute prerequisite for industrial civilization, and oil could only be bought with dollars. However, the accelerating shift toward renewable energy sources, such as localized solar arrays, wind turbines, and the electrification of transport, fundamentally alters this dynamic. Unlike fossil fuels, which must be constantly extracted from concentrated geographic regions and transported globally, generating a perpetual need for international trade settlements, renewable energy is decentralized and generated domestically. A nation that successfully transitions its power grid to domestic solar and wind infrastructure no longer needs to accumulate billions of United States dollars to purchase foreign fuel. Every kilowatt-hour of green energy produced locally, structurally, permanently destroys a fraction of the global demand for the petrodollar. Furthermore, the crushing weight of dollar-denominated debt currently forces developing nations in the global south to continuously extract and export natural resources just to earn the dollars required to service their loans, creating a vicious cycle of extractivism that prevents them from funding their own climate adaptation programs. Thus, the transition away from fossil fuels is not merely an environmental initiative. It is a direct assault on the mechanics of dollar hegemony, entirely decoupling energy consumption from the need for American currency. Can the United States function without the petrodollar? As the architecture of the petrodollar system crumbles under the weight of alternative BRICS payment rails, Saudi divestment, and the transition to green energy, the ultimate question must be addressed. Can the United States economy continue to function without the extraordinary macroeconomic privileges granted by its currency's absolute dominance? The consensus among economic analysts indicates that while the nation will survive, it will be forced to undergo a profoundly painful and deeply disruptive structural adjustment. The immediate consequence of a post-petrodollar world is a catastrophic drop in the global demand for United States Treasury bonds. For half a century, the automatic recycling of oil profits ensured that foreign central banks eagerly purchased American debt, regardless of the national deficit. As that guaranteed buyer base vanishes, the United States Treasury will be forced to attract new investors in an increasingly competitive multipolar market. To do so, the Federal Reserve will have no choice but to permanently raise interest rates and offer significantly higher yields on government bonds. With the national debt rapidly approaching $40 trillion in 2026, the cost of simply servicing the interest on this debt will become astronomical, projected to surpass both defense spending and Medicare to become the single largest expenditure in the federal budget. This massive debt burden will inevitably crowd out domestic investment, severely restricting the government's ability to fund infrastructure, education, and social safety nets. Simultaneously, the reduced global necessity to hold dollars for trade settlement will cause the value of the American currency to depreciate heavily against a basket of emerging global currencies. While a weaker dollar theoretically benefits American manufacturing exports, the harsh reality is that the modern United States economy is overwhelmingly reliant on foreign imports for basic survival. From advanced semiconductor chips manufactured in Taiwan to active pharmaceutical ingredients produced in China and India, the United States imports the foundational components of its society. A depreciated dollar means that the cost of these critical imports will skyrocket, unleashing a wave of vicious import inflation. The American consumer, who for decades has enjoyed artificially cheap foreign goods subsidized by the petrodollar, will suffer a massive erosion of domestic purchasing power, leading to a drastic reduction in the overall standard of living and significantly increasing the potential for domestic class division and political instability. Finally, the United States will suffer a severe diminishment of its geopolitical power. The ability to launch devastating financial warfare, freeze sovereign assets, and dictate the terms of international development will evaporate as nations seamlessly route their trade through blockchain mechanisms like mBridge and the Chinese CIPS network. The United States will lose its exorbitant privilege and will be forced to transition from a nation that rules by decree and financial coercion into merely one powerful voice among many in a highly contested, multipolar financial order. To prevent total economic collapse in this new paradigm, the United States will be forced to abandon the era of endless deficit spending, balance its trade strictly, and drastically reduce its consumption to align with its actual domestic production capacity. A painful medicine that Washington has historically reserved only for the developing nations of the global South.